Hi and welcome back to my channel. It's Leanne here, back with another resin video, and this time this is a video using the Let's Resin molds, the large geode coaster molds as shown here. They're really kind to send me these molds in this resealable bag that keeps them clean when you're not using them. As you can see, it is made of a sort of rubber thing, and inside the little card that comes with them, this one just has their business details, but on the other bags I had, they actually had tips for how to keep the bubbles out of your resin, and they're really handy for when you're not using your molds. Now, as this is a really large mold, I'm actually going to cut it up because I would rather be able to move my mold around while I'm using them. So I'm just going to cut off the ones that I want to use. And this in no way actually affects the use of the mold. It just makes it so much easier to use large molds like this when they can be cut apart. Now, the link for these molds will be down below in the description. And since getting this mold, I have only seen that they now do separate ones, so I'm not sure if it's the same ones, but they're linked below. I'm going to be working on this one and one other today, and this whole video is going to be experimental, trying out some techniques for making natural geodes. Now, the first thing I want to do, is I've never used these molds and they're quite large, is measure how much resin I need. So I'm taking some dried rice and I'm filling my resin just to the brim. This is so I get an idea of the volume that I need to fill this mold. Then I'm simply going to measure the amount of rice that is in my mold. Now, this is not super accurate. You can do this with water, but I don't like putting water in my resin molds, as silicone can actually absorb the moisture and affect your resin in the future. So I prefer to do it with rice. And it's close enough to the amount of resin I need. Okay, so once I've got my rough idea how much resin I need, I'm going to reset my scale and I'm going to measure out my resin. Now, I noticed because my resin is a little bit old now that one of my parts had actually started to crystallize. And the way to get around this is to sit your bottle of resin that is crystallized in some hot water for a little while. And this will dissolve the crystals and turn them back into fluid resin. As you can see, it's pretty solid at the bottom of my bottle, as I'm almost out of resin. So I'm just setting it down and leaving it for a little while, and when I come back it looks like this. Completely fluid once more and back to how it was. Okay, so now my resin is more fluid. I can measure out the quantities that I need. I'm just using my scale just to measure part 1, reset my scale to 0 and put the second half in. It's probably one of the most accurate ways of getting your resin measured, and it definitely works for Let's Resin. So once I've got my cup of resin measured out, I'm just going to mix it up so I have a nice full cup of clear resin that should fill my mold. Now, I've got two techniques that I want to try out for these geodes, and this is the first one. This one is separating the colours, and we're going to pour this in stripes, much like a video I made a couple of years ago now, in which I made little tiny faux geodes. So I'm going to try this on a bigger scale by separating my resin into 6 cups with 6 different colours. I'm just adding some glitter to 1 or 2 of them here because I like a bit of a sparkle, but this was a complete experiment and I had no idea if this was even going to work. So I have some mica powders here, and I have a metallic mica powder. This first one is actually a metal powder, which was gifted to me by a friend, and all the rest are various mica powders and powder pigments for resin. I'm going for a pretty similar colour scheme here. I didn't really have an idea in mind of how I wanted these geodes to go. This was purely experimental, so I did quite neutral in case it did actually work, and then I could use them somewhere in my house. So my colours are not too dissimilar. I tried to keep with a theme. And now I'm going to separate my resin into each cup equally. Now, this is the first method. I'm going to call this the stripey method because it's pretty much we're going to be pouring this to create stripes. So I'm putting a little bit of alcohol spray in each of the cups here. I found when I'm using Let's Resin epoxy, if I pre-spray anything I'm using with the isopropyl, I can't even say that word. If I pre-spray it with alcohol first, it actually helps disperse bubbles as you pour into the cup. I've not tried to get rid of bubbles with this resin for this geode because I'm going to be using micas and you won't see any bubbles anyway. So once I equally divide it into all of my little cups here, I'm just going to sit and mix up every single colour. Now I did actually mix the amount of resin I needed a little under, and you'll see why once I've gone through all these colours. I wanted to underfill my mould a little so I can add a final colour right at the end of pouring. So I'm just going to mix these up really well, making sure that all my micas are combined and I have no little powder pigments, no little lumps. You can add more as you go to make the colour more as you desire, but the key is to have everything ready in advance before you pour your first one. Now the reason I used a metal pigment in one of the cups was I had this idea if I did that as my outer colour, I wouldn't need to use a leafing pen afterwards to do the edges of my coaster. Now I don't really know if this worked or not. It did leave a nice coppery edge, but I just don't think it's as bright as a leafing pen, but it still looked okay. So the first thing I'm doing is pouring kind of round the outer perimeter, just to try and give myself a border here, and I'm going to scrape the resin to the edges to make sure it really does touch the edge. Now the second step is to fill in some of that blank space with just thin ribbons of the colour, and this will just help the resin spread a lot faster when you come to start pouring in the stripe method. So I'm just filling in that space. Okay, to stripe you basically pour straight in the middle, one after the other, always pouring directly right into the middle of the previous colour. And the more you do this, the resin will start to spread out and start to form stripes of its own. Now in paint pouring this works great, but as you can see resin is more prone to mixing with itself. So the more I did this, the more I started to see some of the resin colours blend in. I wasn't too fussed because in geodes sometimes the edges are really blurred and blended, and I figured we would see how it ended up. So I just kept pouring my colours into the centre until I used up every single colour. There was no rhyme or reason to the order I did this. I was just pouring and making sure I got every speck of resin from every cup until it was all used up. Now as you can see, my metallic powder actually started to rise to the surface wherever it was, which I've discovered is something that metallic powders do in resin. So as a final one, and because my mould is not full yet, I decided to use 2 of the dirty cups to measure out a new batch of clear resin, and which means that this resin will be tinted slightly by the colours that are already used in the geode rather than being really clear. So I just mixed up a little tiny amount just to give myself enough to fill up the rest of my mould, but I wanted more of a see-through transparent resin right for the centre of the geode. So after a little mix, that one will go directly in the centre. It will push out those stripes a little bit more and give me a space that I can chuck in some glitter or some crystals. You gotta have a little bit of sparkle if you're making a geode. So I poured it in slowly and just let the resin move itself out naturally. I had no idea what this was doing to the front of the resin, but I was kind of liking the effect on the back at this moment. If the front had stayed exactly like this, I think I would have liked it more, but the back and the front end up looking completely different to each other in the end result. So once I've put my clear in, as you can see, it's not completely clear, it's tinted the colours that match the rest of the palette that I used. Then I'm coming back with little shards of chunky, I'm not actually sure what these are, they're not actually glitter, they are little shards of like broken glass type substance. I've had them for so long I don't even know what they are. They're a bit heavier than glitter and are more like really fine little pieces of glass. I wanted something with a little bit of weight so that it would sink to the bottom and not spread out too much, just to give the centre of my faux geode that sparkly crystal look. Now for the second method, While that first one was curing, I decided to try a dirty pour. I used to do acrylic pour paintings, and this is kind of the idea. You basically mix up your colour palettes. You want to do the same step as you did before, although this time I only went for like 3 or 4 colours. I wasn't sure this was going to work at all. After seeing how the geode, the first one, had blended into one another a little bit, I was certain that this one would probably, more than likely, blend all the colours together. So I went for less colours in case that happened, and yep, I did spill it all over my table. Now if anyone's wondering why I don't wear gloves, I've said this in previous videos, I have severe allergies to all types of gloves. But as you can see, my hands always look a little greasy because I wear a chemical barrier cream that is meant for epoxy resin that I buy on eBay. When I find a glove that I can wear, then I will wear gloves. So just as before, I'm putting that outer rim just to create myself a little border, and then I'm going to pour all my resin colours into one cup. Now I didn't take all the resin from that cup, the very bottom of that cup still has a little bit of clear. And I'm just going to pour them all into the centre as if I was creating the striping effect but in a cup. Now as you can see, the resin will sink through, unlike when you do this with acrylic paint, which tends to hold itself a little buoyant more than resin. Resin quite sadly sunk and mixed in the cup as I was doing this. So once I have everything in the cup, you can see it's a big kind of a mess. I did what I do on an acrylic pour, which is first of all you pour it out in circular motions. This is supposed to help you create a sort of a stripy effect. But I could see that it was not working and the resin was blending. So I opted to just straight on pouring in the centre. In a second I think I begin that. Yep, I start pouring straight in the centre without keeping going in circles, in the hopes that any striping left in the resin would come out by just pouring straight in the centre. Now I could already tell at this point that my first method had more control than this method. This one was mixing the resin as it went, but it did still end up with something semi-okay. And once again, just like I did with the first one, with what was left in the cup, I just mixed up a little bit of clear resin which was tinted by the residue of the cup. And once again, I'm using my scales just to measure equal amounts of resin. And they're just cheap scales from eBay or Amazon. I'm sure they were less than £5 posted. So once I've got my tinted resin, this time I'm actually adding my shards into it so that it was mixed in the resin, just to try a little bit different. And once again, just like before, oh sorry, I'm adding a little bit glitter to this one. Just like before, I'm then going to just pour this straight in the centre of my geode. Now as you can see, if you look, this one, the metallic powder came to the surface and started spreading out because I'd obviously used more of it. So this one does look completely different to the first geode. Now because this is a longer geode and not circular, I went back and forward in the centre trying to elongate it a little bit just to match the shape of the geode. And it currently just looked like a hot mess. So the next again day, I came and was surprised that we had any striping at all, considering the back looked like the copper had taken over. But I really hoped this one would look like the back, but sadly it was completely different on the front. I don't hate this one, but I just expected it to be a stronger effect. Maybe if I'd used more contrasting colours, it would have worked better. Now because these were experimental, I'm not actually going to finish these geodes. I'm going to try and make them look a little bit better here by adding some striping of my own. As you can see, the back turned out pretty cool. The front is more subtle. And this one, we really only have about 3 layers of striping. But I do have ideas on how I'm going to tackle that in a future one. So I got out some metallic Sharpie pens and decided to add some stripes of my own just to salvage these so they weren't a complete fail. I hate making things that will just go to waste, and as I wasn't too happy with the outcome, I decided I was going to jazz them up a little bit. These are going to become candle holders for some battery powered tea lights in my room, so I decided striping them was the only way to go. So these metallic Sharpies actually worked really well. They were really subtle, the copper one was. I wanted a variation of strong stripes and subtle stripes, seeing as I never got them from the resin themselves, and decided copper and gold was where it would be at. So I just followed the shape of the geode, went over it a couple of times until I was happy with the thickness, and did both of them. And I also used some gold metallic acrylic paint. This is the Arteza one, and I think the colour for that one is actually just called gold. And this is a nail art brush. It's a very long striping brush, and it's pretty much meant for long, thin details like this. So it worked absolute wonders in helping me create this, and I just loosely followed the shape of the geode, tried to make it a little bit organic rather than precise. And then when I was done with the striping with the pen and the paint on both of those, as you can see, I decided to go around the outer edges with just a little bit of that gold paint just to tie it in. At this point I knew I wasn't going to finish these coasters because I wasn't really happy with how they turned out, but I was still trying to salvage them enough that somebody in my family will like them. So I'm just going around the edges with the gold paint here, just to add that little tiny detail. And if I was going to keep these, I would resin over the top of them and seal in that paint and that pen with a doming coat, and then dome the back of them, and that way they would be reversible. But I'm just going to leave these as is and probably stick them in a picture frame. So that's how they turned out. That was the striping technique and the dirty pour, and I do have an idea on how I can improve on the striping technique for a future video, so keep tuned for that, it won't be long.